Good evening and welcome to the Sydney Writers' Festival, coming at you in a slightly more digital format than we had envisaged perhaps a few months ago. I'm Jacqueline Maley. I'm a writer with the Sydney Morning Herald, and I'm joining you from the Sydney Morning Herald bunker, where they have locked me while I'm on deadline, but I have snuck off for this very important assignment. Now, while our presence tonight might be digital, our dedication to literature and our dedication to all the good stuff like culture and arts and politics is as real as ever. And it's in that spirit that I welcome Julia Gillard, who will be discussing her new book, Women and Leadership, Real Lives, Real Lessons. She co-authored the book with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, whose name I just successfully mispronounced, who is a formidable Nigerian-born economist and international development expert. I say formidable, but Ngozi actually sounds like a lot of fun, and we're going to hear a lot about that tonight, and I'm sure Julia will acquaint us with Ngozi. Before I introduce Julia, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians on the lands on which these events ordinarily take place. I'd also like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the lands and the waters of the Adelaide region, where Julia is joining us from, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Now, Julia Gillard, you might recall, was the 27th Prime Minister of Australia. She currently serves as the chair of Beyond Blue, which is one of Australia's leading mental health charities or bodies. She is the chair of the global funding body for education in developing countries, which is the Global Partnership for Education. She's the inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, which does a lot of research into women's leadership. And she's also become something of a contemporary TikTok icon. Now, for those of you who don't know TikTok, it's a social media platform that's used mostly by very, very young people who upload videos of themselves lip syncing to things. And let's just say that Julia Gillard's famous misogyny speech has taken on something of a fresh life on TikTok. Julia, welcome to the festival.
Thank you, Jacqueline, and I didn't ever expect to be on TikTok. I've joked that I'm very grateful my debut was a take on the misogyny speech, not all of that shuffling that they do on staircases. I'm notoriously clumsy, so that wouldn't have worked for me.
It's probably not something I should mention at this point, but of course Donald Trump's speeches and press conferences have become sort of notorious TikTok videos as well. But yours is much better.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take that as a compliment.
First of all, I want to ask you some nosy scene-setting questions. Where have you spent the pandemic, and how have you whiled away your time during it?
I'm in Adelaide. I came back here in the middle of March when things started to look increasingly grim, and I am grateful that I got back to Australia. I've been here since, doing what a lot of other people have been doing, virtual working. For me, because my engagements are global, that tends to mean that I am very busy really early in the day and then very busy late at night, and I have a sort of flat spot in the middle of the day. But of the bodies I work with, Beyond Blue obviously had to surge to meet the mental health epidemic, which is going along with the crisis. The Global Partnership for Education had to surge because schools are closed in developing countries and they don't have the connectivity to mean that education can happen at home, so special measures are needed. And the Global Institute for Women's Leadership has re-geared to looking at how the crisis is impacting on gender. But it's also given me the opportunity to spend some good time editing and polishing the book before it went to print. So I'm grateful for that.
So that's a nice segue to the book. It is, of course, about women and leadership, and this is extremely familiar territory for you. But why write a book about it, and why write the book with Ngozi in particular?
Well, I came to know Ngozi as a result of my work with the Global Partnership for Education. She chairs the Global Vaccine Alliance, so an incredibly important organisation all of the time, but particularly now during the pandemic. And we found ourselves at a number of international meetings. We got to know each other, we became friendly, and we started having conversations about our own experiences as women leaders, and then looking around the world, what was happening to Hillary, what was happening to Theresa May, what was happening to a series of others. And out of that, we started saying, look, we've got to do something about this. We've got to analyse it. So why don't we write a book? Two busy women, why don't we write a book? And so we decided to write a book which is really about looking at the research that there is into women and leadership. Much of that takes place in universities, and it's, research where the subjects have been students or something like that. So it's done under lab style conditions, if you like. We decided to look at that volume of research, but then contrast it with the real world experience of women leaders, and we interviewed 8 of them to find out, is that research really true in life as people live it? And I think we've come out with an interesting pattern of observations about that. Some of it rings true, some of it doesn't, and then for some women leaders it's more meaningful than others.
So the structure of the book is very specific because you've taken such a huge topic, and as you say, it has so many sort of philosophical or laboratory condition type hypotheses that you've taken. Tell us about the structure and why you decided to structure it that way.
Well, we did interview 8 women, but we decided we didn't want to present it chapter by chapter. This is Hillary Clinton's story. This is former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia's story. This is Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's story. Instead, we wanted to take their words and test a series of hypotheses that came out of the research. So the research was telling us things like people tend to see women leaders as unlikable. They certainly, the research says that people won't accept leadership from women. They won't support women leaders unless women leaders show what they think of as female characteristics like empathy and nurturing. We had hypotheses around a greater emphasis on family structures, around appearance, that women had less room to make an error before they met harsh judgments from the media and from the electorate. And so we worked through and drilled out a series of propositions, and we present them chapter by chapter.
And all of the women, as you say, have very different reactions and very different experiences. So you have a cast of strong female characters. You've got all of your protagonists who are this select and almost celebrity sort of group of female leaders, and they're celebrities in the sense in a sense because there's sort of so few of them. There is just a sort of handful of them around the world. Can you just talk us through some of the female leaders that you were intimately interviewing in this book? Some of them will be really familiar with, like Jacinda Ardern, and others not so much.
Yes, we wanted it to be truly global, and so we do have 2 African leaders, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the first woman to lead a country in Africa. She became president of Liberia after many bouts of very punishing civil war, and then during her leadership, Liberia faced the Ebola epidemic. We interviewed Joyce Banda, who was the second woman to lead a nation in Africa. She became the president of Malawi after the incumbent president died, and she stepped up from being vice president to president. We interviewed Theresa May, who is probably a more familiar name, of course, a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the second woman to serve, Margaret Thatcher being the first. Erna Solberg from Norway, one of those countries that when they do all of the gender indices, Norway, Finland, Iceland, countries like that always come up the top. So we wanted to talk to someone that comes from a country with such a huge track record on gender equality. Jacinda from our region of the world, Prime Minister Ardern. And then we also added Hillary Clinton. Now, of course, she isn't serving as President of the United States, but she'd had such an insight into these issues, we thought we could not leave her out. And we included Christine Lagarde, who was the head of the International Monetary Fund and is now heading the European Bank. She is a former finance minister from France. And when you go to big meetings like the G20, the group of the nations on earth that have the biggest economies, she is treated with the deference given to heads of government. And so she's had a real insight into global political leadership. So it's a pretty big span and therefore a range of experiences. I have missed one. That's the problem when you do a list. Michelle Bachelet, who is a former president. She served twice as president of Chile. And she has served in the UN system. She was the inaugural head of UN Women, and she is currently serving as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights.
I've got to say, reading the biographies of the women, particularly the women from the countries that we don't know so well, perhaps in Australia, was absolutely fascinating. And, these are women who've endured, we thought you endured a lot as Prime Minister, but some of these women have been jailed, they've been tortured, they've had their families at risk. Really, really incredible stuff, and lived through, managed pandemics and all sorts of things. One of the things I noticed when I was reading the bios is that some of the women, or quite a few of the women, seem to have lost parents early on. And I know that this is a phenomenon that's been noted before in men, that, male leaders often have in their bios a parent that they've lost early on. I just wondered what you thought about that and what you think it does to women in particular to take on a great deal of responsibility perhaps when they lose a parent as a child.
Yes, there was that as a theme. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf lost her father, who was a very noted tribal leader and politician in Liberia. Liberia, of course, is a country that was formed when abolitionists in the United States thought that the solution for freed slaves was that they should go back to Africa, a country that many of them had never lived in, well, a continent that many of them had never lived in before, and there was no endeavour to return them to their original homes. Instead, they carved out a new nation. And of course, the local people, the Indigenous people, resented the newcomers, and her father was one of the first major leaders of the Indigenous people in Liberian politics. And she talks very movingly about how the world would come to see him, and then he became unwell and died, and how her family was bereft and impoverished by that. But she had a burning sense that she did want to get back what had been lost when her father was lost. Christine Lagarde lost her father as a teenager too. He had one of the long-term debilitating illnesses, so he was unwell for 4 years and died. And she too talks about how that made her think about responsibility and step up for responsibility. Michelle Bachelet's life in Chile was entirely disrupted when the military dictatorship, the fascist dictatorship of General Pinochet, took over. Her father had been a general, so one of the elite people in the country, but he was imprisoned by the new regime. He was tortured until his heart gave out. Both she and her mother were imprisoned and tortured, and they needed to flee. And in a lovely kind of sense of connection, the first place that they went to was Australia to find, they came here to find safety. And so she too lost her father young. And each of the women, we talked to them about their backgrounds. What emerges as a theme was none of them was hothoused for political leadership. None of them were told, look, young girl, you will be a failure unless you go on to be a president or prime minister. But they were also told to dream big, to aspire. They were never told they can't, that those things were for the boys. And we think that that's an important lesson about what enables girls to come through for leadership.
Yeah, each of them had at least one parent who was very supportive and very loving, and wanted to build them up in the particular talents that they had, which was interesting. One of the things you confront early on in this book is this idea that women are sort of naturally better at some leadership styles, so that they're empathic, they're consultative, they're more consensus building, and maybe not so good at, or not so comfortable with, the aggressive and the adversarial side of politics. You launch into that dichotomy really specifically. Where do you come down? Which side do you come down on with that?
Yeah, there is a lot of, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, our brains are different, and because our brains are different, we do things differently. I'm not a believer in that. And I am not a believer in it because I've looked at fine research done by an Australian academic, a woman called Cordelia Fine, so no mystery as to why she does fine research. And she comes down and basically says a lot of this at the end of the day is neurosexism, not neuroscience. So I don't believe that there is an inherent in our brains baked in male and female leadership style. But, we are subject from our earliest days, is it pink or is it blue? From the first moment that a person says, oh, someone had a baby, was it a boy or a girl? From that first moment, we are all brought up with stereotyping. And of that stereotyping, we allow men to step forward for command and control style leadership. But if women step forward, we expect them to bring with them the traits that we see as feminine of empathy and nurturing. And so, it's impossible to answer the question, who would you be? Who would I be if we had not been subject to that, upbringing, to our culture, to the stereotyping in our culture? Would you be a louder and more commanding person? Would I have been a more directive leader? I mean, we'll never know the answer to that, but we do try and think our way through how much of this is the women choosing their own leadership style and showing empathy and nurturing, and how much of it is because they know there is an expectation that they will behave like that.
Someone like Jacinda Ardern is very upfront, and she talks really openly in the book about how very early on she was like, this is who I am. I'm a pretty empathic person. I'm a pretty non-adversarial person, and this is just the way I'm going to be if I'm going to be a leader. And it seems to me that that's maybe possible in a country like New Zealand, which has a sort of gentler political culture than Australia, for example. But we know that it is true, even if there's not, any sort of biological reason for it. We know that it is true that a lot of women are turned off by the adversarialism and the aggression and the hostility and just the nastiness of politics. What do we do about that, given that it's sort of baked into the system a little bit?
Yeah, I really do think that there's a question about democratic renewal in the age in which we live. Democracies have tended to be very rancorous, partisan, fractious beasts, not just us, but around the world. Indeed, by the standards of the world, I think much of what happens here is on the more placid side. If we compare ourselves, for example, in the United States, whilst we have, a bit of force brought to our politics, it's not the same as the hyper-partisanship we see there. So I do think that people are trying to, unpack what would it mean to live in a world of greater equality, including gender equality, and what would it mean to have democracies that people responded to better. And maybe out of all of that, we're going to end up saying that we value collaboration, empathy, and nurturing in female and male leaders. What would be unfair, and I think is a test that is applied today, is it's okay for a man to be pretty hard edge as a leader because we kind of expect that, but not okay for a woman. So if we are going to value all of these more softer character traits, then let's make sure we're valuing them across the board for anybody who steps forward for leadership.
I want to ask you a little bit about that later on, and particularly in the relation to the pandemic and leadership styles that people have brought there. But I did want to ask you, when I was reading this particular section, there was this really great segment where you talked about yourself, and you said that, I'm well aware that people reading this might conclude that my story of becoming Prime Minister is a story about playing the boys' game and being good at it. And then you say, please excuse me if I bristle at that analysis. Why would you bristle at that analysis?
Yeah, I talk in the prologue about my own feminist journey and how way back when I was a student here at Adelaide University many, many years ago. So I got to university in 1979, so I'm talking about the early 1980s. There was a schism then in the women's movement between women who thought that we as women should be making our way in the power structures that were there. And I'm talking about something very humble, the student union at a local and regional and national level. We should make our way in those structures, and we should make sure women's voices are heard and women's agendas are delivered to, as opposed to women who said, look, any kind of power structure that ends up with people on top, in a pyramid with a president or whatever on top, that's a male style structure, and we reject all of that. And as women, we want to work in our own spaces just with other women. And all of these years later, I think that there's still some of that in how we look at the contributions that women make. We do, dismiss sometimes what women have done in the traditional structures of our society as whether that's politics or corporations or what have you, as playing the boys' game. And I just don't accept that. I think to have gender equality, we need the current power structures to better include women, and there is room for women to come together separate from those structures and advocate and move collectively for change.
You're reminding me of my own undergraduate days with the sort of conflict between the second and the third waves of feminism. But within that, just while we're talking about that, you have this other bit where perhaps you're alluding to this conflict that you just were talking about, where you say that you wonder sometimes whether on your own journey of politics you were an active and analytical feminist, but not a sensitive one. What do you mean by that? And in that same section, you talk about how you might have missed out on the more spiritual aspects, or the more the spiritual aspects of sisterhood and solidarity.
Yeah, I think this early journey and me emerging from it, from student politics, having very much decided that, I was the sort of practical can-do style feminist who would get in there into current structures and make sure that they spoke for women's agendas, that I did reject some of the more consciousness raising, emotional bonding that the women who were staying more exclusively in women's spaces were doing. So I kind of, picked a track. And I think that's partly intellectual and it's partly, personality. I am the kind of person who, I think I'm it's for others to judge, I guess, but I think I'm an even tempered kind of person. I'm not someone who gives way to exaggerated highs or is easily pushed into lows. I'm very even tempered. I'm very, about getting things done. I measure myself and mark myself on working my way through the to-do list. I did that when I was Prime Minister. I wanted to get some big reforms done, and we ticked and ticked and ticked, and we wouldn't let ourselves really spend too much time celebrating an achievement because there wasn't time to waste. You had to get on to the next one. And I don't regret any of that, but it does mean that I didn't let myself feel it a lot of the time. And I think that's particularly true of the various achievements for women. And so I talk in the book about how, I would sort of tick a box when we got more women into Parliament or more women into the Cabinet. That's great. We've got that done. But I wouldn't think about what's going to change in the dynamic, in the meeting, in how people feel about this because there are more women in the room. Now, and I talk about this in the book, have I ultimately got softer as I've aged, or do I just have more time now, or is it a mix of both? Hard to know.
I feel like in your post-politics life where you're hanging out with Rihanna in Malawi and, you're, drinking G&T with Hillary Clinton on the Upper West Side. I don't know, I just made that up, but I'm hoping that's what you do with your time. And, hanging out with Joyce Banda. Are you getting more of that sort of sisterhood and solidarity that you maybe didn't have time for when you were Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think I do. I spend more time talking and thinking about these issues now with women leaders, but also with the fantastic team that I have the privilege of working with at King's College in London, which is, full of young researchers who, they're a lot younger than me, and there's a wonderful dynamic in that. I'm learning from them and their perspectives on their lives and their feminism, and I hope occasionally they pick something up from me.
On that note, I want to talk about clothes now.
Right.
So, because whether or not we like it, women leaders do have to talk about clothes. They have to think about clothes, and certainly their clothes are going to be talked about by other people. And you know that very well, and you devote a section of the book to it. You often got criticised or remarked upon in the press about your jackets. Sometimes it seems like nothing you wore was good enough. But with someone like Theresa May, for example, her clothes and her sense of fashion was almost a positive, or it certainly garnered her attention in the press. I mean, what do you think about the complex issue of what women wear and what women look like, these female leaders?
Yeah, it's difficult, and there's no right answer. Theresa May talks in the book about she's always been interested in fashion. She came to public prominence originally. Obviously, she was prominent in her political party, but public prominence when she gave a very hard-hitting speech at a Conservative Party conference, where she talked about how the electorate viewed the Tories as the nasty party, and they needed to change that. But all of the commentary included references to what she was wearing, including leopard skin kitten heels, and, the fact she was wearing a leather jacket the next day and all the rest of it. So her fashion sense and the fact that she'd come to change things about the Tory party all got combined in her image. But she talks about the positives of that. She talks about being in the House of Commons and a young woman being in a lift with her and her remarking, "Oh, nice pair of shoes," to the young woman. And she says, "Your shoes, Ms. May, got me into politics. I
I love
read,
that.
I read about you and I read about your shoes, and then I started reading more about politics, and now here I am working in the House of Commons." That's a wonderful story. But for every wonderful story, there is the time-consuming, agenda-distorting focus that goes on women's clothing. And we do the comparison with President Obama, who is famous for saying, "I try and take decisions out of my day. I've got lots of big things to think about. I've got lots of decisions to make. So, what I wear, like locked in, I wear the same kind of suit, same kind of shirt, same kind of tie every day. One decision I don't have to make. I eat the same thing every day. Another decision I don't have to make." And a woman leader would find it hard to replicate that because of the degree of attention. To get herself out the door with flat shoes, same suit, wash and wear hairstyle, no makeup.
Did you resent the time when you were leader that you had to spend, or you felt you had to spend in hair and makeup every day? And did you ever think, you know what, I'm not going to do it today, or I don't want to do it today. I'm going to go out without makeup. I'm going to adopt a Boris Johnson style approach to my personal grooming and just come what may.
Well, not when I was going to be out publicly. Look, there is a resentment to it. And Hillary talks in the book about losing 24 days of the campaign. If you add up the amount of time she spent in makeup, an hour a day in makeup for every day she campaigned, she lost a full 24 days compared with President Trump. There were times when that getting up extra early, I was resentful of it. As you would probably recall, when I was in opposition, before I was even deputy opposition leader, let alone deputy prime minister or prime minister, I'd do a regular Today Show debate with Tony Abbott, and we would be on set, ready to go about 7:10, and I'd have to get there at 6:30 in the morning for hair and makeup, and Tony would saunter in at 7:08 as the woman from makeup chased him across the set to try and put some powder on him so he wasn't shiny, and perhaps run a comb through his hair. And you think, I wouldn't have minded that extra half hour. Would have been quite nice, particularly at the end of a sitting week, and then I had to get myself to Sydney and I'm tired.
To be fair on Tony, he'd probably sort of run a marathon or something by the time he showed up at 7 a.m. anyway.
Oh no, absolutely. Yeah. I used to joke when we were when he was Minister for Health and I was Shadow Minister for Health, and we'd end up at these bipartisan occasions, a breakfast to talk about Kidney Health Week or something, and I'd always say Tony's here, he's swum an ocean, he's run a marathon, he's wrestled a bear, and I've just got up and got my makeup on.
You talk in the book about glass a lot. You talk about a glass labyrinth, a glass ceiling, and a glass cliff. Apart from sounding rather dangerous and perilous, can you tell us exactly what you mean by those terms?
Yes, we say there's a hell of a lot of glass. To go through them, I think the most familiar to people is the concept of the glass ceiling, certainly much talked about in relation to Hillary, and she herself has talked about how she's put cracks in that high, hard glass ceiling. So this is really the sense that there is a limit as women go up, and often the limit is between being sort of second or third in charge and the absolute top job, and the woman who breaks through that is seen to have broken the glass ceiling. The glass labyrinth is really an analysis that says, well, gender biases are more complex than the journey between being, in the top 3 or 4 and then getting to the absolute top. For a woman in her working life, from the first moment she starts her working life, there will be things that happen to her where she can see that a man in her position would have been treated differently, but she wasn't. So she is making her way through the glass labyrinth. And the glass cliff is the researched phenomenon, and it is true, that organisations in trouble often reach out for female leaders. So businesses where things are going swimmingly, they wouldn't articulate this, but the thought swirling at the back of their brains is, everything's going well. So when we need a new CEO, we'll get one who looks a lot like the last CEO. So that'll be a bloke in a suit. It's when crisis is hit that organisations say, we've got to do something different. What are we going to do different? And that's when they will give a woman an opportunity.
Is that sometimes coming from a good place or a good motivation, in the sense that they're like, it's a cultural change that we need, and women represent cultural change, and it's part of a much needed diversity or board diversification that is necessary to change the culture of a bad organisation or a bad culture within an organisation?
I think it can come from a good place, and often organisations in trouble recognise that they need to rebuild teams, and they think that women will bring that sort of team building, team bonding skill. But it does give you the perverse problem that when people then analyse, a female CEO's good? Do they do a good job? Do they lead organisations well? And they strip out the context that the woman was given a job because something was going very, very wrong. Then it's easy for people to snapshot conclude, actually, women don't make good leaders because that business didn't get more profitable or whatever. And we point to a piece written in the Times that did that kind of analysis. It did a very quick, a woman gets the job and the share price goes down, without understanding the context that the woman got the job because the business was facing, very difficult conditions.
Yeah. You talk in this book about things that you would have done differently yourself when you were Prime Minister. You say that you would have called out the sexism against you earlier. I wanted to ask you what would you have called out? What specifically? How would you have done it? And you also say that you wish that you'd asked leaders, community leaders, particularly male leaders, to be on board and to call out the sexism against you. Can you think of anyone or how you would have done that?
Yeah, I can, and one of the features of the book is Ngozi and I have a chapter at the end that we call the standout lessons, and they're not just lessons for women. We hope that men will read this book. We hope lots of people will read this book, and that media representatives will read this book, because there are lessons for the media in it, lessons for men, lessons for women. of the things that we conclude as lessons, it's that it's very important, forewarned is forearmed. If a woman knows that she is likely to encounter these gender characterizations as a leader, she can think about it in advance. And if she does that, of the advice we give, we talk about calling it out early. So rather than just letting it become the norm that surrounds you, actually pointing to it early and saying, why is it? Jacqueline, you might have a view on this. If I had said on day 2 as Prime Minister, when the tabloid newspapers around the country were referring to, it was actually the day 3 headlines, were referring to the jacket that divided a nation kind of thing, the jacket I wore on day 2 as Prime Minister. If I'd said to the press pack then, is this the way it's going to be? Like, you're going to report what I wear, not what I say? Is this who you are in the Canberra Press Gallery? Like, how do you feel about that? Would it have not allowed the focus on appearance, to settle into the norm? Would responsible journalists who take pride in their reputations have said to their editors, look, I'm not going to be associated. I'm not going to have Jacqueline Maley as a byline next to, puff pieces about what the Prime Minister's wearing. Can we cut that out? Now, I don't know, but it's that kind of thing that I was hoping to explore by saying call it out early. And then we can't put all the weight of this on the shoulders of a woman leader. If when it was getting truly crazy, with the signs calling me a bitch and a witch and things like that, I think it would have been a powerful intervention if maybe 10 or 20 male CEOs or chairs of the board from Australia's biggest companies had put a letter in the newspapers saying, look, we think there's, and I think they probably would have said this, look, we think there's legitimate criticisms of the Gillard government. We are engaged in policy debates about the following things, and we intend to continue our views in those policy debates. But we don't do our politics like this. Like, let's just cut this kind of stuff out about the first woman to lead the nation. I think that would have made a difference.
There's something also that the media probably could have done or could possibly do in the future is ring up those male CEOs of the big companies and ask them directly what they think about, those kinds of gendered attack that you sustained. I want to talk now about style, because you devote a section of the book to that, shrill versus soft. You say that the research shows that people don't like so much these agentic women, as you call them, so women with agency, but men, on the other hand, will get marked up, or male leaders will get marked up if they show so-called female traits like compassion, empathy, considerate behaviour, because they're outperforming expectations. I know that you don't like to talk about contemporary politics, but do you think that leaders who have done better in the pandemic have been those ones who've shown that empathy and that consultative style and sort of the more consensus building style?
Yes, broadly I do. I think that the research, and we explore this, we talk about shrill or soft, the style conundrum, the kind of narrow pathway women leaders have to walk where they're seen as strong enough to lead, but not so strong that they tip over into hard or uncaring. So they've got to show that nurturing side, but they can't show it too much. Otherwise, people will say, oh, she's a big softie, she's not up to the job. And in the next chapter, we drill down into that even further under what probably will be quite a controversial headline. We call that chapter, She's a Bit of a Bitch. And we explore in that the psychological research that shows that people do easily conclude that strong women who own ambition particularly are unlikable and not the sort of person they want to politically support. So we work our way through that. Looking at the pandemic, I think around the world, the style of leadership that has least worked is that, blustering strongman style of leadership, the sort of man who presents to his electorate and basically, 9 times out of 10 with an issue, a leader like that can, barrel their way through basically saying, I definitely think X is the case, and anybody who doesn't agree with me is just stupid, and X is definitely the case. And because so much of public policy is so nuanced and the timelines for points of proof are long-lived timelines, leaders who are like that can barrel their way through. What they can't make that work for is a pandemic where, the science is the science, the virus is the virus doesn't listen to you hectoring it, it's not interested. And so we've seen that style of leadership associated with particularly bad performance. And I'm thinking here of, leaders around the world, but I would include very particularly the current president of Brazil, Mr. Bolsonaro, who has taken that approach. I think at this time people have been looking for warmth, they've been looking for empathy, they've been looking for reassurance, and female and male leaders have shown that, but I think people are particularly noting the way women do it. Jacinda Ardern, Erna Solberg in Norway had a little virtual town hall event with kids, so kids could ask her about the virus. And people, want that kind of to feel enveloped in someone's caring at this time.
You talk when you talk about that line that women have to sort of tread. You use the term bilingual as well. You sort of say that the thrill versus the soft, and you've got to balance both. But then at the same time, women can fall prey, or female leaders can fall prey to a self-consciousness and a sort of they're constantly checking themselves and second-guessing themselves whether they're doing one more than the other. I wondered, and when I was reading that passage, I thought of your Real Julia moment, which became quite a notorious moment for you on the 2010 election campaign. Do you think was that an example of you second-guessing, second-guessing yourself and being a bit self-conscious about who am I really and who should I be showing to the public?
Yeah, I think all leaders, all leaders all leaders need some time to find their style. It doesn't happen overnight, and when you're in leadership, and particularly when you're in leadership sort of suddenly, there's a need to find the new style. Not I'm saying new style, but I don't mean that people should discard or do discard what they've been like before, but there is a different set of pressures. Even being deputy prime minister, being obviously very well known in Australia and having what I said weighed and all the rest of it, there's an intensity to the spotlight as prime minister that's different. And, you in that want to show your capacity for leadership. You are watching every word because you don't want to make big errors. And it does mean, I think, that it's easy to become quite stilted in your delivery. And I think for women, because you're probably unconsciously knowing about this, if I look too tough, if I look too soft, you do get very much into the second guessing. So yes, I think that was in my head from time to time. We talked to Theresa May about that because, she suffered from that analysis in an even more exaggerated version than me. She was christened and routinely referred to as the May bot during her time in politics. Obviously a use of her name and the word robot. Including some very cruel pieces about, the May bot is malfunctioning, and, the May bot was asked to show human empathy and broke down, so and we do make the point, once these characterisations settle around women leaders, they can be very hard to shift.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a lot about a bit about tears, actually, because this becomes a thing in the book and for female leaders, and it was a bit of a thing for you. I remember at one point, to cry or not to cry, because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Do you settle on one or the other? Should female leaders cry, or should they remain stoic?
I think it depends on the individual, and our leaders took different views on it. Christine Lagarde said she's a weeper and she never puts...
Well, she's French,
Yeah, she's French and never puts mascara on her bottom lashes because she knows she's likely to cry in a day. Erna Solberg talks about, you can cry at something emotional. She talks about, memorials in her nation, for example. But if you ever looked like you were crying for yourself, then that would, be something that would bring the furies onto a woman leader's head. I still think it's, in some ways a harder thing for women.
Bob Hawke famously cried for himself on television when he was very upset about his daughter, and nobody marked that against him.
No, nobody did. But the research does show that because the gender stereotyping we all hold in our brains is so clearly there, that it can actually work for a man to go against that stereotyping. So it does show, this has been shown in corporate research, that a man who shows kindness will be marked up. A woman who shows kindness won't be marked up or down. It's just expected. That's baked in. You expect a woman to act kindly, whereas if a man does it, you're like, oh, he's a really nice bloke. And so people mark that up. And I think the same is a little bit true of tears. I mean, what is always frustrating, and we make this point in the book, is you never get to run the control test. I mean, there's never going to be a moment when we've got a male leader and a female leader who are in exactly the same political circumstances, crying over exactly the same things, so we can measure the reaction. So there's always judgment in all of this. But my judgment is because people still think there's a risk women are too weak to do the job, that tears can count against her.
One of my favourite parts of the book, or one of my favourite anecdotes, was when Erna Solberg has to ask her, or Erna Solberg's communications advisor has to tell her what resting bitch face means. And in this sort of very earnest Scandinavian way, she's like, okay, well, I'll just smile more.
Yes. Yes, we do have a discussion about resting bitch face, Erna Solberg needing it explained. I had to explain it to Ngozi. And it's our way of getting into a discussion about, the views that people take of powerful women. And the research there is very compelling. There's a wonderful piece of research from the US where, they get two groups of, randomised groups of voters, and they get them to watch an actor. So one group watches a man, one group watches a woman, but both of these actors are giving exactly the same script, and it's a script about why you should vote for me to be a senator. And the script includes lines like, I'm the kind of person who gets things done. I might have to step on someone's toes, but, I always bring the thing home in the end. And the man pays no price for that. And the woman pays a terrible price in the eyes of these, voters who are watching her perform. So there certainly is that reaction, that tendency in us to not want to support, not like, be even quite contemptuous of women who are that strident about themselves.
I want to ask you one more thing about women, and then I'm going to move on to some of the audience questions because I've been hogging too much of the questioning here. You often hear the phrase women are each other's worst enemies, and women feminists, we hate to hear this phrase because we know, about sisterhood and solidarity. But at the same time, most of us will, or many of us will have had an experience with a female boss or a female co-worker where we've felt that person has undermined us or been threatened by us in a way that is particularly about our femininity and our femaleness. Do you address this phenomenon in the book? And you sort of link it to the politics of scarcity, as you call it. Can you explain that, tease that out a bit?
Yes, we do. We have a chapter exploring exactly this. It's entitled after the Madeleine Albright saying there's a special place in hell for women who don't support women. And we ask the question, how crowded is hell going to be? How many women are going to be down there? And we talk about it through the frame of the politics of scarcity. And what we mean by that is often women have been put in artificial competitions with each other. So, a board of directors is diversifying, and instead of having no women on the board, it's known that of the 10-person board, over the next few years, they're going to appoint a couple of women. And then women will end up in a competition for those couple of spots. And that competition can get very fierce and, bruising for the women involved in it. And yet, if we follow that track down of women competing with women, we lose the more profound debate, which is, hang on, a 10-person board, if it was properly selected on merit, given merit's equitably distributed between the sexes, it would end up, half men, half women. So instead of this, forced competition for such a narrow slice while you take 8 of them, what about we actually open up the debate and not have the women run against the women, but look for gender equality in the board and free everything up? We talk about that. We also talk about the research that shows how, unfortunately, organisations in pursuit of gender equality do tend to settle at the common point. So there's tokenism. Oh yes, we better have a woman. Oh right,
better have a chick.
Yeah, we've got one now. Tick. We don't need another one. And then the fact that there's not another one is viewed as, oh, maybe it's the woman who's pushing other women away, whereas really it's this tokenism. And then we talk about how that's morphed in some places into toucanism, that the benchmark that's accepted now is you should have 2 women. But once you've got 2, job done. So we try and debunk that kind of thinking.
Mm. Yeah, let's not be crazy. Let's not go crazy and get 50-50. I mean, come on. You ladies have got 2 spots. That's enough for you. I'm going to turn over now to some of the audience members who have sent through questions on the website. Leonie Seaton asks that if you could go back in time to when you were PM, is there anything that you would do differently?
Oh, look, there's lots of, big and small things. I mean, I've talked particularly about some of the things I would do hopefully better to prosecute the campaign in support of emissions trading and pricing carbon. But relevant to this, the main thing is really this issue of calling it out earlier and trying to broaden the alliance against differential gender treatment.
Jackie Triffett asks, what situations have made you question your leadership style?
Sort of all and any of them, really. I think the older I get, the more instinctively suspicious I am of people who, in the face of complex tasks, go, I've got this. Because normally across my life, when I've seen someone do the I've got this, actually they don't. And it's, best for everyone to be a bit humble in the face of the challenge and thoughtful constantly about what are you doing right, what are you doing wrong. So, I still think I'm learning new things about leadership. I've learnt new things about leadership through writing the book and the research that I've been exposed to, so we can all get better.
I want to finish now by asking you something a little bit difficult, because when your experience as Australia's first female Prime Minister was quite brutal in a way. And one of the things that, I think we're only just really having a conversation in Australia about the underlying misogyny in our society that allowed that brutality to be directed against you. And I worry and I wonder if there are women who lived through that time, who were young women or even teenagers during that time, and saw the treatment that was meted out to you and thought, if that's politics as a woman, count me out. I don't want anything to do with it. It's too awful. Is that something that you worry about? And what would you say to those young women?
Oh, I constantly worry about that. And frankly, one of my huge motivators in when I wrote my biography, my story, I devoted a chapter to gender. Doing the thinking work around that chapter led me to pitching this idea to King's College London about having a global institute for women's leadership. What I learned in that global institute has then helped me put together the book with Ngozi. But all of those things have spiralled out of my concern that women and girls were taking away the wrong message from my period. I was really conscious after I finished being Prime Minister that polls were showing that women were looking at my experiences and saying they were less likely to go into politics. And so all of this work in the years since has been my answer to that, because the message from me to those women and girls, I want to be, go for it, absolutely go for it. We need women in politics. If you've got a passion for change, there's no better way of pursuing it than politics. Get right in there. But I do feel I have to put the next sentence, get right in there and understand it. And this book with Ngozi is one attempt by me to help women understand it, what they're likely to face. And the more light that gets shone on those issues, the more I hope that they shrivel and go away. But they're only going to do that if we talk about them and bring them to the forefront. So you will see at the end of this book a message from me and Ngozi that says, go for it in capital letters. And then we say, yes, we are shouting. And I'm definitely shouting that message out to women and girls in Australia.
And this is certainly a wonderful handbook, I would say, for any young women who are thinking about entering politics or leadership of any form. One sneaky last question, which is about your knitting, because I think when I interviewed you last year and you had said that you'd fallen off with your knitting a little bit, I wondered if you'd gotten back into it in the pandemic, as a lot of people have.
I haven't yet, but I have this dream, and the dream is that I have enough time to, go all, tidy everything up, the spring clean. I haven't done that yet. I would like to get into the drawers, get into the cupboards, do a spring clean. When I do that, I'm going to find bits of wool and balls and patterns everywhere. Then I'm going to get them in some order, and hopefully that inspires the next project.
Good. Well, I look forward to the Etsy store that Julia Gillard will soon be setting up with her crochet and knitting products. Julia, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you tonight and to pick your brains about this very important subject. And I do think that there is, the conversation has moved on so much since you were Prime Minister, and you were such a trailblazer, obviously. I hope that the conversation and the experience for female leaders only gets better and better as a result of, at least in part of your work. The book, Women in Leadership, is in all good bookstores and online online bookstores from which date?
The 12th of July.
12th of July. Thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with the book, and I hope that your virtual book tour goes very well.
Thank you very much. No, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia.